Okay, good evening everyone. Welcome to our evening Dhamma session. Today we're doing questions and answers. So I'm like to just start by addressing what I'd said last week. I was a bit, I think, concerned about the potential for a obsession with asking questions, right? Because if our Buddhist practice becomes just about talking about the Dhamma, wondering about the Dhamma, speculating about the Dhamma, it can be misleading. It can be problematic for the progress of our practice. But that being said, I thinking about it, it's really pretty awesome to have this. I mean, it's an honor to be asked questions, and to have so many people wanting to hear what I have to say on things is an honor, really. And it's an honor to be able to answer questions about the Buddha's teaching. So on the face of it, it's really a great thing. I mean, it's great. Our whole community is really pretty incredible. We're all quite amazed that we have this online community together of people who, most of us have never met. I guess I'm lucky I get to meet many of you, come to visit me, or we do video chat, or sometimes we do a study group together. But I would just think it's worth appreciating how great it is that we have this opportunity to share the Buddha's teaching, and something that I believe in quite strongly, and I think it's exceptional that 2,500 years later we're still able to get together. I know the medium's a little bit different, but we're still able to talk about these things, to practice these things. Right? So let's go through the questions. No complaints. But always this slight concern that we don't think of this as the practice of the Buddha's teaching. This is a chance to talk about those things that get in the way of our practice of the Buddha's teaching. Okay, so first question. First question is one I probably wouldn't normally answer, but it's well worded, and I think it's a good opportunity to sort of talk about Buddhism in general. So the question is what the difference is between Theravada and Zen, particularly the difference associated with Zazen and Vipassana meditation. Is one likely to lead to Nibbana, while the other is fake Buddhism? And then the general complaint that it's very confusing to sort through the various sects without being puzzled by their various similarities and differences, particularly in terms of meditation practice. So I guess I'll start by not really answering your question, by talking about the second part, and just hopefully providing a little bit of clarity about what is Buddhism, right? What is Buddhism? I took an introduction to Buddhism recently at university. I thought it would be interesting. It was interesting to be in the class, I was able to help out a little bit and contribute. But they used a textbook that was entitled Buddhisms. And I think that's fairly accurate, if a little bit misleading, in the sense that it, of course, has to try and treat all of them equally, right? And the Course attempts, as best it can, to talk about them as if they were parallels, which isn't quite fair. I don't think. I think it's hard for me not to sound biased, but when we talk about Buddhism, and I mostly focus on my type of Buddhism, right, Theravada Buddhism, the difference is, generally speaking, are important. So Theravada Buddhism has a we can say, two sets of texts, two strata of texts that it focuses on. And the texts are important in defining Theravada Buddhism. Well, it'll be different when we talk about other types of Buddhism. But for Theravada Buddhism, there's these two sets of texts. There are the Pali Canon texts, and then there is the commentarial texts. So the canon, the Tipitaka, is claimed to be the Buddha's teaching. It's original, authentic, it is what it purports to be. So it purports to be the teaching of the Buddha, some of his close disciples, and a few books that are pretty clearly later, and don't really make much pretension to not be later. But the majority of it is claimed to be what the Buddha taught. So there's that part, and then the other part is commentaries on that set of texts. Right? These two together make up the Theravada, and it's important to talk about that because it defines a very specific and very ancient set of teachings. You might say dogmas or beliefs or religious principles or religious doctrine, I guess. So it's quite internally consistent, maybe not completely. It may not be exactly what the Buddha taught. We don't have any proof that it was actually what the Buddha taught, except that when we practice it, it appears to be something quite profound. And for those who practice intently, they will swear up and down that it is definitely the teaching of an enlightened being because, well, it's enlightened as far as the teachings go. But it's a very old and very specific set of teachings. You've got what we claim to be the Buddha's teachings, and then you've got commentaries on it. Now, they're putting aside whether they are the teachings of Buddha, because, of course, many different schools claim to have many different texts that were taught by the Buddha. But it's very internally consistent and quite simple, really. If you read the texts, people in our tradition who have read through these set of texts and then go and read other sets of texts that claim to be Buddhist are struck by the difference. How much more flowery and how much more complicated, I don't know what the right word is, there's a word that I can't find, but they're not as straightforward, would be a sort of a pejorative description of them. But what you get with other types of Buddhism, and so this is in strong contrast to sects of Buddhism or types of Buddhism like Zen, where the majority of the teachings are much later and claim to be much later. You know, there's the teachings of Bodhidharma, and there's all these teachings that are thought to be canonical, but are much, much later. When you focus on Tiantai Buddhism, there are much later teachings. And there's much less of a cohesion to the teachings. You know, some of them try to bring in texts from all over and texts that don't really have any frame of reference for where they arose, and have a much greater emphasis on modern or at least pseudo-modern, semi-modern texts and commentaries. They're generally in different languages, a lot of Chinese. Of course, with Zen, it's a lot of Japanese. So we're not talking about something quite so ancient or so cohesive. Why I approach this question from this angle is because I want to personally cast a difference, not to disparage necessarily. I mean, I'm not that fond of other types of Buddhism, obviously. I mean, that comes across, I think, in the things that I say. But putting that aside, to be fair, Theravada Buddhism is quite internally consistent. It's quite simple, I mean, from my point of view. Okay, other people might say not. Zen is seen as quite simple, but it's simple in the sense that it's quite straightforward. There's nothing surprising in the sense of how it's composed, right? You've got texts, they teach something. It's clear what the texts are, and you follow them. They're internally consistent. They are what they are. So it's a package, I guess, is the point. It's maybe not quite fair of other but it's I think it's hard to find another type of Buddhism that's quite so straightforward. And I didn't mean to quite sound so positive about Theravada Buddhism, but when you're talking about being confused by all the types of Buddhism, I just wanted to point out how understandable that is, because Buddhism it's just a word, and what you're talking about is a lot of different teachers, a lot of different teachings that gets quite complicated quite quickly. Which text you're focusing on, which teachers, and who's enlightened, who's not, and so on. And I think it's fair to say that with other schools of Buddhism, it's not as easy to define what the teachings are, and to even get a grasp of, okay, these texts, right? Whereas with Theravada Buddhism, you have that. Again, I don't mean to be so disparaging, but when you try to compare these types of Buddhism, you're talking about two fairly different approaches, and you're talking about this nebulous sort of cohesion that Buddhism doesn't really have. It's the cohesion in Buddhism that makes everything Buddhism is understandably nebulous, because there are so many different teachings and opposing views in different schools and so on, that something that from a Theravada point of view seems quite simple becomes something quite complicated. I don't know. I'm supposing that people from other sects would probably argue, contest that point, but I didn't want to try to end up promoting Theravada. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to maybe explain why I'm not really keen on answering questions about other types of Buddhism or comparing practices, because to me it's like comparing apples and oranges. It's two fairly different things. Theravada Buddhism is one thing, and most other types of Buddhism are something, from my point of view, something quite different. That's all I really wanted to say about that. So when you ask me about the difference between Theravada and Zen, Zazen and Vipassana meditation, it's not fair to compare them like as two different practices, because what is Zen, right? What is Zazen even? Depends very much on who you talk to. What is Vipassana meditation? It still depends, but much less, right? Vipassana meditation depends much less on who you talk about. Like take the Goenka tradition and the Mahasi tradition. These are the two modern Vipassana traditions. They're different, but read the theory behind what they teach. Like their techniques are quite different, and the way they go about it is different, but if I read anything that Goenka wrote, it's quite clearly from the same source, talking about the same things. What is Vipassana? To see impermanent suffering and non-self. It's going to be the same from tradition to tradition. I don't think it's fair to say that about Zen, because it's much more nebulous. It's not completely nebulous, and there is something. It is a valid meditation practice. There's nothing wrong with these other types of Buddhism. It's just hard to pinpoint them down, and it's not fair to then say, well, Buddhism in general is quite nebulous, because no, within our tradition it's really not. Which is why personally I stick to this tradition. I don't know. I feel like I've really come across as down on other Buddhist traditions, and well, it's not really fair of me, I think, to say on public forums, so I apologize for that aspect of what I said. Again, it's my personal opinion, and I can't avoid that. I'm not too fond of other Buddhist tradition. Sorry. How do I test myself that I have truly forgiven someone after they have hurt me? Should I look at it in terms of lack of harsh speech and anger and ill will and hatred? I wouldn't worry about that. I mean, that's a very egotistical question to ask, and I'm not trying to attack you or insult you, but be clear about what that question... why I say egotistical is because that question is talking about a self, a continuous self. I who have forgiven someone. What does that even mean? I mean, you could come up with a definition that means that anger never arises towards that person, but the only way that's going to happen is if you're an anagami. Otherwise, anger could always arise towards that person. So, rather than trying to ask that sort of question, you much more be, this cliche idea, but it's not cliche, but overworked concept of staying in the present moment. And it's overworked, but you have to say it again. Be present now. Are you angry at this person now? No. No? Good. If yes, bad. And take things as they come. And be clear that the only way you could truly not get angry at someone is to become enlightened. So don't worry too much about whether you are or aren't. Just try your best. What's going on here? I'm clicking on... Okay, can someone tell our IT people... When I click on a question, it just disappeared. What happened? Does anyone see that question? I clicked on answer. Now it's gone. Did someone delete it? Maybe someone else deleted it. Oh, I was just about to answer that one. I don't know, maybe it wasn't appropriate. The Upanishad Sutta mentions that suffering is the supporting condition for faith. Could you explain that causality? So suffering causes faith. Well, the Buddha taught that there is suffering, so when people see that, it gives them confidence in what the Buddha taught. Yeah, life isn't just a bowl of cherries. I can't always get what I want. I don't know, offhand I don't remember the Upanishad Sutta. But I wouldn't confuse Abhidhamma causality with this sort of teaching. The Buddha's speaking rhetorically, and to some extent, he's speaking conventionally. Suffering doesn't directly lead to faith, but it certainly can, and in a general sense, practically speaking, it does. You hear about the Buddha's teaching, and you say, there's no suffering. My life is perfect, and then you suffer a lot, and you're like, oh yeah, maybe the Buddha was right. Maybe I am susceptible to suffering because I have my attachments. Oops. Oh, I know what I'm doing. Am I hitting the wrong button? Shoot. I just disappeared a question. Oops. It was something about I have great anger towards people. No, I see everyone with great evil. Every being, I see every being as having great evil, and I have a hard time not getting angry. What can I do? Something like that. I mean, I'd recommend practicing meditation, because you can't just fix things, but try your best to be mindful. Is belief in Buddha's protection just psychological help, or involves some divine beings guiding practitioner on the path? Oh, it can. I mean, there's no law to it, but if you focus on the Buddha, the angels will be keen on you. They'll be keen to protect you. If you're a kind and compassionate person, apparently the angels and spiritual beings are much more positively inclined towards you. I don't have a lot of experience with that personally. Like, I'm not a sort of person who can see angels, but that's what they tell me. If I'm understanding correctly, right view of the Noble Eightfold Path states to only base our views on experience. It doesn't really. right view is a view, and views have various levels. So if you have belief in the Four Noble Truths, that's right view, even though you haven't experienced it. It doesn't actually say only base your views on experience. But that being said, I've addressed this question because the question is talking about how can one claim that reincarnation or the existence of spirits such as Deva are fact if they have not experienced it? One can't. But the belief in such things is not wrong view. It's just belief, belief as opposed to view. And there is a difference, because I have had people tell me about the existence of angels, and those people seem to be reasonable and wise, and so I believe them. Just like I believe in Australia, because I've never been there, but, well, I mean, it's a little harder to disbelieve in Australia. I've met Australians, and they tell me they live there. But then they're not nearly as wise as these people who tell me about it, devas, angels, and so on. As far as rebirth, or reincarnation, or the continuation of the mind after death, that one's a bit different. I think when you meditate and see things clearly, it's not a hard concept to understand. It's quite clear that the mind is capable of continuing irrespective of whether the body continues, irrespective of what happens to the body. It's altered by the body, it's affected by the body, it can be crushed by the body in the sense of controlled if you have like part of the brain messed up, but once the brain dies, it's not the end of the mind. Maybe that's a different one, I think. But still, there's no, that's just evidence or sort of a framework for understanding the possibility, but we still don't have proof that we're going to be reborn, right? That there's going to be a continuation of the mind after death, just like we don't have proof that the mind suddenly stops when the brain dies. We do actually have some evidence, third person, no, what's the word? Impersonal evidence, people whose brains have died and yet they continue to experience, and they're able to relate experiences, that sort of thing. If someone tells me there are angels and I believe them, it's different from me then claiming that I know that there are angels, or I know that there is rebirth. Right? Anyway, I mean, the point is that the Eightfold, the right view is not simply from experience, but in terms of understanding, in terms of holding a view, the most useful form of view is direct experience. Like, my belief in angels is far less powerful or meaningful than knowledge. If I had seen an angel, right? It's much more meaningful, because then I could say, hey, I got a friend who's an angel and he lives in this tree out back, and I talk to him every day, or her every day. That would be much more meaningful for my view, and it would support my view. But it doesn't mean that my view has to be. It doesn't mean that my view, right, as it stands, not having an angel in the tree out back, is wrong view, or is not right view. But that being said, what you're thinking of is, in order for right view in terms of knowledge of the Four Noble Truths to lead to Nibbana, for it to be perfect right view, it's necessary for that view to be empirical and personal, experiential. Right? You have to actually experience the Four Noble Truths in order to become enlightened. So for it to be noble right view, it has to be empirical. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have anything to do with it being wrong to believe things that you don't have empirical evidence about. I may have kind of made that sort of been vague before about talking about that, about, all kinds of views that aren't empirical are not right view, but it's nuanced, because there's so many things that we believe and they don't get in the way of our practice. We believe them for practical reasons. I believe that my bedroom still exists. I believe that anyway, so many things that we hold belief only that we, even though we don't have knowledge. Is loneliness the same as boredom? And are they both caused by kama upadana, wanting to please the senses? I don't know where you would get that idea. Are you thinking Abhidhamma based? Loneliness is it depends. It could be a desire for companionship, desire for certain experiences, or the concept of being associated with other people. Or it can be aversion, in the sense of sadness at not having those things. And it's probably both of them in alternation, right? You want them, and you feel sad because you don't have them, that sort of thing. Boredom is quite different. Boredom is an aversion to what you're doing, or it's a desire for no, it's not a desire. It's usually based on a desire for something more exciting. You think of something that you want to be doing, or something that excites you, and you're not getting that, and so you feel bored. They're quite different. Both caused by kama upadana. They both can be. I don't think that they always are. They can be caused by bhava tanha and vibhava tanha as well, I think. But yeah, usually the sense is it's common. Did the Buddha stress more on the 3 marks of existence than the 5 precepts? I don't know what kind of a question that is. I mean, what did the Buddha stress on most? It's hard to say. I mean, sila, samadhi, panya. The 5 precepts aren't all that important because they're conventional. But sila, which is the basis of the 5 precepts, is essential. The 3 characteristics are panya. So you need sila, samadhi, panya. You need these 3. And it requires both of them. The 5 precepts themselves are just a sort of the boundary. If you're breaking the 5 precepts, it's very hard to see impermanent suffering, non-self. When you say to watch the rising and falling of the abdomen, yes, okay, let's be clear. The rising and falling of the abdomen is an English expression. And if you're not a native English speaker, it's hard to understand. And I realize this problem. They don't use rising and falling in most other languages. Pong na, yup na, that's Thai. Pong means to expand, or to get full of, to expand really. And yup na means to fall or to contract. Well, fall, Yup means to, it can be translated as fall, but yup means to collapse. That's the word. Yup means to collapse. So it's not referring to a rising and a falling as terms of up and down, as if you translate it literally. But if you're an English natural speaker, you know that rising is the expansion of the stomach and falling is the contraction. But that's what it means. It means the outward movement. So it's the latter. It's not the rising and falling of the midriff in a literal sense. It just means expansion and the contraction. I think it's because when you're lying on your back, of course, it does rise and fall. In terms of the afterlife, is there an advantage to focusing on meditation during a lifetime over focusing on devotional singing, chanting sacred phrases, and prayer? There's an incredible advantage over that. Meditation purifies the mind. Singing, chanting, it's a different kind of purification, but they can be purifying. But they're artificial. My meditation is more beneficial. Is first of all, it's because more pure. It's more. It's more direct in the sense of directly addressing the problem, but also because it can, if practiced correctly, deal in wisdom. And wisdom is special because it's the core for future arising of wholesome states, right? If you actively and artificially try to be wholesome, it's a one-off thing. But if you learn the difference between wholesome and unwholesome, then you're much more, which is wisdom, then you're much more inclined in the future to be wholesome, right? So it's powerful on a whole other level, as giving you the impetus to be more wholesome in the future. Sometimes you speak about magical powers like flying, mind reading. Do you truly believe these things to be possible? Yes, I do. I'm not just referring to stories. I do believe them possible. I believe lots and lots of things are possible. So if that's hard for you to swallow, I apologize. I do understand that it's not useful for ending suffering, though. So there we go. Don't worry about it too much. All this stuff that you find hard to swallow in Buddhism, it may not be quite fair for me to say it, but it would do, regardless of whether it's fair or not, it would do you good to just put that aside, not worry so much about it. We're so quick to jump on these things. Which would be fine if we knew as much as we think we do. But Western science can be quite arrogant in terms of deciding what is real and what is not real. It's just gotten so tunnel vision centered on the physical that it's become arrogant in terms of disregarding the potential of the mind. That might sound arrogant in itself, but I'll stand by it. I don't have all the answers. The problem is that we don't have the same sort of, in modern times anyway, we don't have the same sort of evidence to provide that one is accustomed to, right? You're accustomed to so much evidence from a physical point of view. From a mental point of view, it's harder to get that evidence. You can't get it in the same way because you can't easily show it to other people. Not the way you can show the physical. How can an anagami still have ignorance if belief in self and doubt in the Buddha are gone? Because ignorance is more primary. You have to understand, ignorance means there's still things that they don't know, they don't understand. And it's more like they don't understand clearly. The ignorance of an anagami is so small. It just means that they're still not perfectly clear in their minds. But it's minuscule. It's not something that's highly problematic. Can effect exist without the cause? No, by definition, no. I think by very definition it's impossible. This is just I don't know that this is a particularly Buddhist question, but if you call something an effect, by definition I think it requires a cause. What are your thoughts on marijuana? I was almost going to talk about this for my current affairs or current events. What are your thoughts on marijuana use to relax? I think it's probably very problematic. I don't know really, but marijuana use was probably one of the dumbest things I ever did. Dumbest, I don't mean in the sense that I was dumb doing it, but it was just a dumb thing. There was nothing ever... I never got off on using marijuana. It never occurred to me, wow, this is a useful thing for me to be doing. So for relaxation and enjoying the psychoactive effects, I think that's highly problematic because it's avoiding your problems. It's the opposite of what we're trying to do in meditation, and the lack of clarity that comes from it is the opposite of what we're trying to do, this sort of stoned state. It's not cool. It's just like anything else. I mean, there's nothing especially wicked about marijuana use. It's just anything that distracts you. And these things are worse because they directly deal with the brain. So psychoactive drugs of any kind. I mean, compare marijuana with, Ritalin or I don't know, any of those SSRIs. Marijuana is probably worlds better. I mean, it definitely is, right? It's a whole, which kind of, makes you wonder if instead of all these crappy drugs, people were to just smoke marijuana, the world would probably be, we'd probably be in a lot less trouble than we are now in the Western world. Or I don't know, the modern world maybe in general, by taking all these terrible SSRI drugs. So I think it's worlds better than that stuff. But it's still highly problematic because you're cultivating these states of addiction to, and it's addiction. It's an addiction to the relaxation. It's a psychological addiction. It makes it harder for you to deal with stress. There's a term or concept I read again and again, early Buddhism. What is the difference between Theravada and early Buddhism? Jnanavira Thera, don't bring him up. I don't know too much about him, but he's highly controversial. So, yeah, he rejected the Abhidhamma because he'd not accepted as a later, newer script. How do you see that? I mean, I think the Abhidhamma is great. I don't think anyone really, I don't think the Abhidhamma that we have was actually taught by the Buddha. But I do believe that it was passed on by Sariputta and his followers. So how much later it is, I don't know. But, I mean, Sariputta got it directly from the Buddha, and Sariputta put together the Abhidhamma Pitaka, except for Book 5, which is much later. But early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism is about as early as it gets. There are other texts that are probably contemporary, but Theravada Buddhism, you don't get much older than that. Not that we have what we have left, what we have extant. Do you have any recommendations for people who actively meditate and follow the teachings of the Buddha but don't have access to a community other than the internet to practice with? Well, you could do an online course with me. That's about all I got. If you want to do an online course, we have online meditation courses here. I mean, I've been asked this question many times, and I've tried my best to help out with that, but I don't have a solution for that. Move to a place where there is one. Really, it's a good idea, honestly. Would a blind man, a deaf man without a tongue and a sense of touch be born? I don't understand that question. I think it's somewhat speculative. Not going to answer it, sorry. That's all the questions. That was good. How are the comments doing? I'm not going to read them. I'll go through quickly. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, good evening. Something about sexist. I think you're the most pretty and beautiful. I don't want to read these. YouTube. Well, I think they're behaving, which is good. Second Life, we've got a small audience tonight. Well, thank you all for coming out. That's all for tonight. Have a good night.